Hello, comrades. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Tonight in our Communist Culture Club, with us to introduce the subject is Ken Syme. So over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, comrades, and welcome to the webinar. Constructivism is for me a fascinating subject, and I'm pleased that we're able to open this presentation with a quick tour of constructivist buildings in Leningrad, courtesy of YouTube. So we shall play that video and then I'll talk to you a little more about the nature of constructivism.
In this video, I will show you top 10 of the Leningrads, or now call it St. Petersburg constructivism. Let's begin with the House of the Soviets, or the House of the Consuls. It's one of the most significant examples of the Soviet constructivism in the city. Built in 1930, the House of Soviets was conceived as a part of the composition of Kirov Square and the new administrative center of the Narva district of St. Petersburg. That's how it still is. There was a meeting room in the cylinder of the building. It is contrasted with the vertical of a 50-meter tower with a hammer and sickle. To enhance this contrast and asymmetry, horizontal strip glazing is used. This is a large-scale and unique project that uses all the main techniques of the Leningrad's avant-garde. The successful functional arrangements of the premises is confirmed by the fact that they are still used for the original purpose. Now this is the Gorky House of Culture, which is located not far from the House of the Soviets of Narva district. Built in 1927, it was the first house of culture in the country. Straight lines, massive glazing, and the absence of decorative elements make it a classic example of constructivism. Only the symmetry of the composition is not typical, but it is something that helps to create the monumental effects of the building. This project received the Grand Prix at the World's Exhibition in Paris and had a great influence on the further development of the avant-garde. Also, right next to the Gorky House of Culture, this is the House of Technical Studies. It was built in 1932 according to the design of the same architects as the Gorky House of Culture and is its logical continuation. The cultural center didn't have enough premises for clubs and courses, as a result of which it was decided to build a special educational institution. The building has a parabolic shape, which is a consequence of the convenient shape of the classrooms, and there are stepped windows along the stairs. The architect of the project, Alexander Gigelo, called the building a game of volumes. Now, there are shops in the building. Still on the same prospect static, this is the school named after 10 years of October initially, what means 10 years of Great October Revolution. It is still a school. To be exact, a Lyceum, but with a more simple name. Just a Lyceum number 384. The Ushakov Public Bathhouse on Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya Street 7. The Ushakov Bathhouse, called like that because Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya Street back then in 1928, when it was built, used to be called Ushakov Street. It has received the name Gigant, giant, since at the time of construction it was the largest in the city. The project was also based on functionalism. Initially, the building was two-story, then a third floor was added, thereby violating the geometry of the lines. The location of the Ushakov bathhouse is no coincidence, because there were many enterprises nearby, the largest of which was the Putilov plant, now called Kirov plants. All workers went to the bathhouse to wash, so giant was in a high demand. The house commune, or should I just say it, communal house of engineers and writers on Rubinstein Street 7. In terms of architecture, this building can hardly be called outstanding, but its main historical value lies in its idea. Its layout had to meet the new tasks of socialist society, namely to create a new way of life in a communal house. The commune implied a rejection of individualism, common chilling areas, libraries, wardrobes, hairdressers, showers, and canteens. At first, residents used public spaces, but soon the lack of personal space began to cause inconvenience. The house began to be called the tier of socialism. Gradually, the entire house was remodeled. Ligovsky Public Bathhouse on Ligovsky Prospect 269. Built in 1934, this simple, functional building with unusual parabolic shapes is one of the typical projects of the Leningrad avant-garde. Unfortunately, the building doesn't have the status of an architectural monument, and it was already under threats of demolition. Now, the bathhouse is planned to be reconstructed into the offices. And now we are moved to Moskovsky Prospect, Moscow Avenue of St. Petersburg 129, and the building of Moskovsky District Council of St. Petersburg. In 1935, it was the new administrative center of the Moskovsky districts of Leningrad. The main room is made in the shape of a cylinder, with the usual contrast of vertical rectangular parts and a canopy. The cylinder created a kind of atrium, and the corridors were replaced circular galleries through which it was easy to reach any parts of the building. The less popular functions of the center were moved to a 3-story building located along Moskovsky Prospect. Until now, the building houses the administration of the Moskovsky districts of St. Petersburg, district courts, and other government agencies. On the other side of the prospect, right in front of Moskovsky District Council, here is located a former house of culture named after Ilyich, means Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Built in 1931 as the House of Culture for the Elektrosila, Electroforce plants, it is still preserved its original look and layout. Now it's called Moskovsky Center of Culture and Leisure, and these days one of the most leading cultural places of Moskovsky district of St. Petersburg, with a wide range of different events. Now this is what is called Factory Kitchen in Vyborgsky districts of Leningrad on Grand Samson Avenue 45. In the 1920s, 1930s, these so-called kitchen factories were built in many areas of Leningrad. These were public spaces with dining areas, shops, and chill zones. Workers came here to eat, or lunches were delivered to nearby factories. It was believed that workers shouldn't waste time preparing foods, and therefore this function should be completely transferred to such canteens. Asymmetry and expression of forms, strip glazing, make the kitchen factory in the Vyborg districts a striking example of the Leningrad avant-garde. And like all constructivist buildings, the building follows the principles of functionalism. Even the most unusual forms have their own function. For example, the canopy was to be used for an open terrace. And in the end of today's stop, probably the most preserved and renovated constructivist masterpieces, the Levashovsky bread baking plants and the building called Krasное Znamya, the Red Banner. Both of them are located close to each other in Petrogradsky district of St. Petersburg. In 1933, the Levashovsky bread baking plant you see now was the first bread baking plant in Leningrad. It operated until 1990s, after which the building was occupied by various tenants. Now, some of the premises are being demolished and some are being reconstructed. At the moment, it is turned into a nice cultural space. And finally, Krasное Znamya, the Red Banner. As of 1937, this was the new building of a knitting factory, founded yet back in 1855. The dynamic facade, as conceived by the architect, should resemble a ship that pulls production along with it. This is a unique example of expressionism and the most famous St. Petersburg monument of constructivism. In 2018, the building was restored. It is planned to create a public and business center here.
Thank you, Tina, and thanks to our YouTube guide there. Constructivism is a movement that flourished essentially in the 20s in Soviet Russia. And the significance of that date, apart from its being only a few years after the 1917 revolution, is the extreme shortage of material in Russia for building, which makes those constructions even more remarkable. And it is further remarkable that they are still standing. I've selected a few illustrations of my own, which we may see next. There's a brief glimpse of the Tatlin Tower, one of those great buildings that was never actually built. It was intended to mark the Third International, but because, as I said, of the extreme difficulties in finding sufficient steel, etc., to make the construction, because of the complexity of the design, it remained a paper tower, but nevertheless a fascinating design. A workers' club designed by Rodchenko. Below that, we have a set of designs by Leonidov, who I'll come back to a little later. But we can now move on to the next slide if we can. And what is constructivism? Well, as was mentioned in the video we've just seen, part of the objective was to construct an environment suitable for a new way of life, for a socialist way of life. The argument being that if you simply left the built environment as it was, that environment was designed essentially for capitalist living. And without the buildings changing, people's behavior would remain the same. An expression which you will sometimes hear used in discussions of constructivism is social condenser, which might sound alarming at first glance, but basically signifies a building which, through its shape and design, encourages people to live in a more collective and less individualistic way. And that was a strong feature of the early buildings of constructivism. There were instances where the design wasn't perfect and people tried to go back to old ways of living. But it was one of the, I believe, relatively few instances in modern history where buildings were made as a method of directing people's behavior, of encouraging a particular type of behavior. One of the other key elements of constructivism, and one that I'll sort of spend quite a bit of time on in this presentation, is what we've called in the title town planning, but it's actually town and country planning, because the constructivists took seriously Engels' observation that the contradiction between town and countryside needed to be removed. And we will return to that theme later as we look next at the first 5-year plan and the consequences that had for constructivism. Now, when the 5-year plan was put together at the meeting of the Bolshevik Party, the key drive was essentially building industry. There was a recognition that, you couldn't just work on industry and leave agriculture to look after itself. You had to try and develop the two in parallel. The concern that the leaders of the time had was that they did not have the machinery, the tractors, the equipment to enable agriculture to move forward in step with industry. But to make those tractors and to make that equipment, they needed an industry that was capable of doing it. So there was a dilemma there. Part of that dilemma, and one that came to feature quite heavily in constructivist thought and planning, was where did you put the new factories? There was an argument that you put them in existing urban centres. Equally, there was an argument that you should move factories nearer to where that raw material required for the factory was being mined or processed. And that argument went back and forth for a large part of the years following the development of the 5-year plan. Interestingly, one of the influences on the thinking were a couple of American authors. One of them, Alfred Weber, was very much of the view that you moved a factory close to where the material that factory would be working on could be found. So in effect, you had to construct a town around it. The other American thinker who influenced constructivist thinking at this time was Ebenezer Howard, who's generally remembered for his views on the Garden City. And that sort of began a debate within the constructivist family, if you like. And you had two communities, one of them called urbanists and the others called disurbanists. The urbanists, as the name suggests, were very much focused on taking factories, material, etc., to the towns, to the existing towns, perhaps building out of them a little into the country with what they called corridors into the garden. Contrast that with the so-called disurbanists, who took quite a different view in terms of dwelling places. They were less in favor of the communal houses, some of whom we've seen described in the video earlier, and more in favor of smaller building units, perhaps units that could be put together, but in their vision, those units could be disassembled and put together in different arrangements, as for example, if you had a couple who initially moved in together but wanted to separate, you could somehow detach their dwellings and move them elsewhere. Now, these ideas remained theories. They were never actually built in practice. Again, I come back to the difficulty in finding material. A further difficulty was that the focus at the time, driven by that 5-year plan, was very much on industry and building metal, making it the era of the car, the era of metal, as Stalin said. There was very little money or resource available to pursue the kind of projects for different ways of living that the constructivists were interested in, particularly the so-called disurbanists, who would have required significantly more funding to develop their proposals. So these debates continued for a considerable length of time. As I said, the constructivists did value Engels' proposition that you needed to remove the contradiction, the gap between the town and the countryside, to have, in his view, a healthier way of life, a way of life that would, in his view, eliminate some of the pollution of the air, the soil, the sea, and give workers an environment that was productive rather than stifling. But this debate ran on for some considerable time within the movement. And we come to a point, looking at the dates below, you'll see that that runs, if you like, from 1930 to 1937. But it's instructive to look at the statement that emerged from the 1930 People's Committee, in which the constructivists are, in effect, accused of being extremists, at some point accused of being leftists. And this may strike a chord with a number of viewers here. The irony is that the two individuals mentioned, Sakharov and Larin, were at the extreme ends of the debate among the urbanists and the disurbanists and those who were looking for radical change and less radical change. The first person named was certainly more intent on doing this, if not quite in the single leap which he's accused of making by the People's Committee, at least in more dramatic steps, whereas Larin, who was also named with him, was one of those arguing very much for small incremental steps. So in accusing both of them, the People's Committee were effectively saying, it doesn't matter how you do it, we are against it, essentially. And the movement continued. They went on with their building in a slightly more subdued and restrained way, but it was obvious that the regime was less and less sympathetic to their views, and frankly less sympathetic to any really radical approaches to architecture. And a couple of years later, they, in effect, dissolved the various little groups of architects and made one single union of Soviet architects, obviously as a mechanism of trying to make everybody follow a single party line. And the final straw, if you like, came in 1937, when it was inscribed in the statutes that socialist realism was the only permissible approach for architects, which effectively ended constructivism as an approved approach within the Soviet Union. It didn't end the career or the activity of the architects involved. A number of them went into what were regarded as less controversial projects. Parks, for instance, were areas that they helped to design. And Ginsberg, who was mentioned in one of the early slides, actually had Leonidev, also from one of our earlier slides, working with him on a staircase within a park, which was sort of distinctly less ambitious than some of their earlier projects, but nevertheless enabled them to keep going. But one of the key features to me of constructivism, despite the, if you like, extravagance of some of their notions, which is the way some people regarded them, they were the first to significantly consider how you address the conflicts between the city and the countryside. They did this in the 1920s. In Europe, some of the larger architectural associations began to look at these in the 1930s, several years behind the constructivists. And you can also contrast the constructivists with, for example, what was happening in Italy round about this time, because in 1922, Mussolini came to power and you had a particular, in fact, to be fair, a number of styles of architecture associated with the regime. One thing that didn't feature in the regime was much consideration of the environment and much consideration of how you wanted people to behave, other than, perhaps you could argue, a style of building which attempted to intimidate people and compel them to obedience to authority. But what was happening in Russia was significantly more progressive. It was an experiment that was cut short, partly because Stalin was uneasy, to put it mildly, with the more radical notions that they had, and partly for economic reasons. There simply wasn't the material or the funds available to them to take forward their plans. What they were doing, had at a smaller level been attempted in other countries before. Interestingly, in sort of 19th century America, there are a number of fairly small local initiatives where people attempted to construct environments designed for their particular way of life. I'm thinking of, for example, the Shaker community in America. But the constructivists were the first to do it on a countrywide scale. And if you consider the scale or the sheer size of the country they were trying to work in, their achievements were remarkable. One building we haven't mentioned here is the dam on the Dnieper River, which has featured for less pleasant reasons in some recent news bulletins. But their achievement was, I believe, remarkable, even if a number of their designs, many of their designs, remained unbuilt. They disappeared to a level from public view after 1937, when socialist realism sort of was proclaimed the true path. People began to look at them again in the 1950s, and they continue to influence architects like Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil and Le Corbusier with their designs well into the 20th century, and to a level even now. So they deserve to be remembered, and I hope that this session may encourage you to go and explore their careers and their activities in more detail. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ken. Shall we show a bit of Ginsberg?
Please.
So here's a picture of him. All right, here, I've got it. I can share it now. All right. This is the Narkofin building, modernist building at the heart of the Soviet Union's culture wars. Yes, they had their own culture wars, sort of, a bit different than ours today, but yes. So this is the outside, and then there's pictures here of the inside, which are quite striking. So all the same shapes, horizontal, but also broken up, a lot of glass and vertical lines, etc. Form follows function. Very cool. The idea behind it is, of course, hugely progressive. The idea that you live and you work and you shop and you play and your school and the kindergarten and everything is nearby makes, of course, total sense. I mean, it is clearly a way to, yes, abolish the contradiction between town and country is a very good idea. The 15-minute city. Do you
I
like
mean,
about that?
the 15-minute city is, an idea which appeared to gain quite a bit of traction a few years ago, but now seems to have slipped back, almost gone out of fashion before it came into fashion. And you're correct, much of it was, if you like, influenced by the constructivist notion of giving people the facilities that they needed within easy reach, so that you didn't have to sort of travel 20 miles to get to the nearest shop, etc. I've not seen any statement, certainly from the new Labour administration, as to whether they are in favour of pursuing the 15-minute city idea. It would certainly harmonise with many of the environmental concerns at the moment in terms of reducing, petrol consumption, etc., etc. But sadly, it seems to have sort of flickered and died, is my impression. I hope that's not entirely true, but I couldn't say I could provide you with any evidence that there's much momentum behind it at present.
Also, I think because some right-winger have adopted it, so it's become like almost it makes you a conspiracy theorist to talk about 15-minute city. It's absolute nonsense. The idea is clearly just to live and work where you are, and everything nearby makes a lot of sense. Now the contradiction, I mean, there's loads of contradictions obviously in the Soviet Union, starting from, as you say, the lack of materials, the lack of money after the Civil War, a country bled dry, but an explosion of creativity. We've seen it with art. We've had sessions on that before, where people wanted to take charge and wanted to do things differently, and we came up with all these ideas. The tension between the lack of money, the ideas to change the way we live, and then of course the contradiction with you have to control it all, which started pretty quickly afterwards. I mean, you're saying that the constructivists, they didn't quite go the same way of some of the other artists, so they weren't all wiped out by the purges. Were they, or were there a trend within them that got wiped out as well, or
Well, I mean, like almost any part of Soviet society, some of them fell foul of the purges, but a remarkable number of them appear to be able to continue, if you like, more subdued careers elsewhere in parts of the community where, like I said, parks, etc., which didn't particularly trouble the regime what you did or didn't do in parks. So that was almost a safe space. So it's interesting. I wonder if part of the reason was also the fact that they were a relatively scarce resource, architects and such. And perhaps there was a slight glimmering of common sense within the regime that if they sort of slaughtered all the architects, there'd be nobody left to build anything at all. That may have given them a certain amount of longevity that wasn't granted to other communities. I mean, poets they could slaughter happily because they didn't particularly see poets as people that would build or do anything useful for them. But architects had an evident function that could be useful to the state, and that may have granted them some protection.
Yeah, good point. I think that's a good guess, actually. In terms of then the idea of the constructivists is also quite a grandiose one, isn't it? The communal living, and you use the bathhouse together, and that sounds a bit dodgy, but I mean, communal kitchens obviously is a huge step forward for women. I wish we had communal kitchens around these days, looking after children, kindergartens, etc., factory bathing houses, communal livings. How successful do you think they were on their own terms? I mean, the short video showed that sort of some of them went back to, sort of the redesign to, but that's probably came a lot later. But how successful were communal kitchens, factory kitchens, etc. They lasted quite some time, didn't they?
They were relatively successful. They lasted some time. Whether that's because there wasn't much by way of alternative is a possible question. But the reality is they couldn't build them even on the ideal terms they would like because of the constraints we've mentioned already. And there was a level of resistance. Perhaps they didn't get the support from the rest of the state that would enable them to persuade people to give them more time. They had some success, and they had instances where they were, if you like, implemented in a clumsy way that meant they weren't successful. But I personally remain of the view that they were an experiment worth making and worth pursuing for longer than it actually happened. But whether anybody now is willing to pick that up, I'm not confident. But I certainly think it is, I think, consistent with the idea that if you want to move away from capitalism, you do need to live and work in a different way. You can't simply preserve the old structures because the old structures carry with them the old ways of thinking, and people will just go back to where they were. And in that respect, they were correct in seeing the need for a change of the environment. They may not have got it exactly right, but they didn't have too much time to do it, and they had far from ideal conditions to carry out their experiment. So I still think it's a path we could pursue fruitfully.
Well, absolutely. And in terms of, the liberation of women, just starting there from, housework and looking after children, etc. Right next door is another woman doing exactly that. And, it absolutely makes no sense at all. But that also requires, of course, the abolition of the family as an economic unit, which is, of course, very much a necessity, but would scare probably a lot of people when you talk about it like that. But it's definitely needs to be in our program, and we need to think about it. Ian wants to say something. Hello, comrade.
I've not studied this, but it has been of interest to me over the years. I was a student in Moscow from 1990 to 91, 10 months in all, and there were other visits as well. And I took quite a lot of interest in the architecture. A word on bathhouses in Russia, because there was a bath, a sort of public baths movement in Britain in the 19th and 20th century, because, of course, most people didn't have a bath at home, so you had to go to the public baths. But Russian bathhouses are very different and have a much longer history. And it's rather like in Finland or other parts of Eastern Europe, where saunas are a communal way of getting clean. It was also enormously sociable. When I first went to St. Petersburg, there was a nice old bathhouse that was referred to locally as the Rasputinskaya banya, Rasputin's bathhouse, because he was reputed to have frequented there. And it was one of the few places where you could buy beer. And you could buy beer and black bread, and it was a place to go and socialize. And there's even a film called Slokhin Parm, which is a strange Russian phrase, which means literally, I congratulate you on the best steam. It's the sort of thing you would say walking into a bathhouse. Slokhin Parm. And it was a film about whose custom was to go to the bathhouse and they get drunk, because that's what people do. That's what men do in bathhouses. There wasn't as much drink available for women in bathhouses. They get drunk and they end up in the wrong houses because they were all built the same way. They were all built to a template, so they couldn't recognize their own homes. But what I also wanted to say was that what was the relationship, for example, to the Bauhaus movement in sort of 1919 to 1933 in Germany? There seems to be some overlap there.
Yeah, I mean, there was a relationship, and even though, as I said, many of these designs weren't built, they were published in magazines, and those magazines were available to those who, in the end, sort of formed the Bauhaus movement. And there was a considerable sort of influence that crept in, largely through the periodicals and the architectural journals that were published in the 1920s. And they did influence, as you can see, if you compare some of the designs, the work that was done in the Bauhaus itself. But, you know, as you suggest, the Bauhaus came later. The Soviet constructivists were the first to come up with these ideas.
What about the Vienna? You know, there in Vienna, there's a few projects like that, Red Vienna, where you had exactly that communal living, communal bathhouses, etc. But they were later, weren't they? They probably took inspiration from the
Yes.
constructivists.
Like I said, the Soviet constructivists were the first. They were the leaders in modern architecture and modernist architecture. And they inspired a lot of the movements that came later, including the ones we've just mentioned. Despite their sort of, if you like, relatively limited period of activity in historical terms, their influence stretched quite wide in terms of time and indeed geography. Like I said, you know, Niemeyer in Brazil was influenced by particularly some of Leonidov's designs.
We had a few questions in the chat where people are asking if you could put some suggested reading perhaps forward. I know there's also a video that you were going to mention.
Yeah.
We can put that in the email.
Indeed. There's I think 3 books that I mentioned to you, Tina, which, you know, might be worth putting into the chat. But, you know, the video that you referenced, there's a YouTuber called The Finnish Bolshevik, no spaces, just one word. He takes a different view of constructivism to myself. He tends to repeat the line that it was a sort of bourgeois movement, which is rather a slur that crept in from the Stalinist period, in my view. His videos are worth watching, I believe, even if they are somewhat lengthy, simply because he has put together quite a useful collection of illustrations of material from the time and some contemporary buildings that survive. But for those that are interested in exploring more about constructivism, I'd recommend in particular Anatole Kopp, whose book Soviet Constructivism, which was published in the early 2000s from memory, does benefit from access to a lot of material which previously had not been released, because, as I said, you know, the movement was somewhat suppressed after socialist realism became fashionable. So Anatole Kopp, K-O-P-P, would definitely be someone I would recommend to look out for. His books are available, though possibly not immediately in your public library, given the state of our libraries at present.
I'm gonna put all the links in an email because I don't have access to it now. But Ian's got another question, yeah.
I was just the other thing was really good example of moving the factory to where the raw materials were was the town of Magnitogorsk.
Yes,
where I went, and of course Magnitogorsk literally means magnetic mountain, and it was a vast mountain of iron ore, and it was the factory that produced most of the tanks for World War II and much of the steel of the Soviet Union, not least of which because it was far enough away not to be captured. The other thing I was going to mention was I remember walking around one of the galleries in Moscow, and the stark difference between the pictures that were painted and drawn in the 1920s and 1930s was there. By the 1930s, they were dreadful kind of socialist realist awful rubbish, and the impact of Stalinism was palpable, and the same goes for the buildings, where actually a lot of what was passed off as socialist realism was actually closer to neoclassicism, if anything, and you know, with all its implications of the power of the state and stuff like that. And of course, although it's quite different, I mean, you see how influential this has been on British industrial architecture. I was thinking of things like the Hoover Building and the Firestone Building, stuff like that. Yeah, but I suppose the main contradiction, of course, was the Soviet Union was never in a position to abolish wage labor, never in a position to abolish, you know, and a genuine sort of world socialist society would be looking at the abolition of wage labor, and from that point of view, the abolition of the factory, the abolition of a whole, you know, completely different ways of working altogether.
Absolutely, we wouldn't build bigger factories, but yeah.
And Magnitogorsk was a city that Leonidov was quite closely involved with the designs for that. Not all of them were made, but he was certainly an integral part of that. And going back to your point about the sort of the architecture that, for example, was developed in Moscow and the rest of the Soviet Union after the war, what they did was they went backwards. They went backwards to the sort of neoclassical models, to sort of the early Russian architecture. So rather than build in a new modernist style, you had a reversion to old, established architecture, an architecture which, as I've said, was associated with an older form of society, certainly not a modern and innovative socialist state. The architecture that was favored by Stalin tended to be the architecture of old empires and indeed czars. So there was a deep contradiction between the architecture that Stalin favored and the alleged nature of the society he was leading.
There's a question in the chat from Christine. Were cities in the countryside or areas in the countryside linked to collective farms with local food for local people? And was there an attempt to redesign some of these collective farms? I've briefly watched Sergei Eisenstein's film, I think it's called The Line, which is 2 hours, a bit boring, but it's got some communal farms in it, you know, the collectivized farms, etc., and everything is shiny and new, and every cow had a little nice cubicle, and it was nicely designed. Do you know anything about what did that spill to the countryside?
Well, the collective farm architecture isn't something that the constructivists had much engagement with. And as you suggest, some of the designs as presented in the film are on a par with the designs in films you will see of our, if you like, security agencies and NSA. They all look terribly bright and shiny, but they bear little resemblance to the truth. As I said, the Disurbanists had little opportunity to build their designs, and they didn't have much engagement with the whole collective farm movement because it wasn't really a movement that was much in harmony with their real objectives. The collective farm movement, I would say, is a movement aimed at basically squeezing as much out of the people on those farms as possible, rather than any attempt to give them a good environment to live in. But you know, that perhaps is a subject for a separate debate.
Yeah. We've got nobody else with a hand up, so I suggest we actually share some more of those pictures, and perhaps you can, if you know anything about it more, Ken, you can perhaps talk us through. I can tell you what I'm seeing, because I know you got trouble with your eyesight. So we've got the Shukov Tower in Moscow, built in 1922. It's currently under threat of demolition, but an Italy campaign to save it. What do you know about the Shukov Tower?
Well, that was Tatlin again, and as you say, it's one of the examples of the fact that Moscow, there isn't much by way of movement to preserve the architecture of the constructivist architects of the 1920s. It's under threat from the sort of, if you like, capitalist atrocities that Moscow seems to favor putting up at present. But, at least it's a building he actually managed to get put up. So it's...
So here's the tower again. Why was that not built, actually, the Tatlin Tower?
Simply because, if you look at the design, which was in the second slide in the presentation, it was a kind of a double helix, which was a very bold and innovative design. And A, it probably scared people a little, and B, like I said, you needed significant quantities of steel and iron and concrete to have any chance of making that a success. So I think the reasons for it not being built were in part an apprehension about that level of novelty, but I think primarily just the economic difficulties it would have presented at that time.
Well, they've got this little model built, which looks quite impressive.
Well, there's a model, and I think there was a model that was briefly on show at an exhibition in the University.
Showing it on screen at the moment. Yeah. I've got a picture of it on screen at the moment.
Yeah, but it was, I believe, on show in the University of East Anglia in conjunction with some exhibition or other earlier this century.
Now we've got, this is Nikolai Ladovsky, a collective housing design. I don't know if you can see it, Ken, but it's like building blocks of a child stacked up on top of another. I mean, that looks a very daring design. I don't think that was ever tried.
No, that was never tried, but part, as you're suggesting, part of the theory was that you could shift part of these little blocks around if people wanted to configure themselves in a different arrangement. But another one of these concepts that never quite got realized.
I mean, actually, we had Ursula Le Guin, the Dispossessed, the other day. We talked about that. She actually mentioned that in her book, in her idea of the sort of socialistic, anarchistic society. They live in areas where when you grow as a family, well, you don't move the blocks, but you just you shift to a different area of the house, etc., and you all stay together in a communal living type place.
Well, that's another illustration of constructivist ideas sort of living on, if you like.
Yeah. This is the print shop of Ogonyok magazine, designed by Lisitsky. He was a famous one, wasn't he?
He was a very famous artist rather than an architect, but he was part of what you referenced earlier, the flowering of creativity that followed the revolution, and survived in pockets despite Stalin. But it's just extraordinary if you look at painting, at literature and architecture in the years immediately after the Russian Revolution. It shows just what the potential for human beings could be if we could get back to that.
And if we let people run free and allow them to explore their creativity. This is the Textile Institute in Moscow. Seems to have been built in 1930 to 38. 8 years it took. That's one of the famous round shapes, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, it illustrates that despite the fact that during that period it was out of favor as far as the regime was concerned, nevertheless some of the projects continued and were completed despite the disfavor of those in power.
And it is, I mean, you did mention it earlier that it's quite amazing. They're still standing, most of them. I mean, there was one bathhouse which I think the guy says they used the wrong materials, and it sort of got a bit too moist or whatever. But there are loads of these still around. It's quite something. This is the Red Carnation factory in St. Petersburg, which doesn't really look like form follows function, because this looks like a really strange tower. Do you know anything about that?
That's one I don't know very much about, but again, thank goodness it survives. It illustrates that there are different ways of doing things, that you don't have to just repeat the same old formula time after time, and that more than 100 years on, they're still standing, which is quite extraordinary.
Chernikov is the architect of this. Then we've got the Maxim Gorky Theatre in Rostov-na-Donu, which looks a bit like a big block. That's not so nice, this one. This is 35. And then we got the MPS building in Moscow, Ivan Fomin. So it's a lot of these round corners, isn't it? What was the idea behind that?
Well, cylinders were a common feature of the design for sort of ergonomic reasons. And there was also, and it's not something you see quite so much of, the idea that you had interlocking cylinders, sort of horizontal and vertical, for people to travel through. There are a few examples of that, but not so many. And the cylinder obviously is sort of, has a number of advantages just in terms of, the perspective it can give you and the opportunity it can give to shift things around in a space which isn't rectangular.
Very rectangular town hall by Noy Trotsky.
No relation. Yes.
Relation, I would have thought so now. Yeah, that's not a, that's a bit more brutalist. Is this the dam you were mentioning earlier? This is by the Vesnin brothers?
Yes, yeah. And it was an extraordinary production at the time. And I think it was, at the time it was built, the biggest dam in Europe. And just shows the diversity, if you like, of what the constructivists did, from bathhouses to hydroelectric dams.
This is quite cool. This is the Interest Garage by Konstantin Melnikov. So what is that Interest Garage? What on earth is that? Any idea?
That one, you've got me stumped there, but it's an intriguing design. So
it certainly is. Oh, okay. Well, we'll just have to guess and look at the next one, which is the political convict's house. Keeping political prisoners. I mean, this is also not a particularly nice structure, I have to say. I don't know where it's down as one of the constructivists. Why would you think this counts as a
political convict's house? That's an interesting sort of, you wonder what the commission for that looked like.
Yes, absolutely. Anyway, when we've got Mossel Prom building by David Cogan, 1923 to 24. I mean, it does have sort of avant-garde, Art Nouveau.
Well, there was a sort of, there was some Art Nouveau influence on some of the early constructivists, because I should have emphasized that it was a relatively diverse movement. They weren't all building in one particular way, and some of those in the early years were influenced by Art Nouveau. One thing I didn't mention was something called the Realist Manifesto, which you can find online, which is written in fairly florid language that you might more readily associate it with Art Nouveau. But that was part of the beginnings of the constructivist movement. I didn't mention it because I think it's, in the end, it wasn't typical of what they were trying to do, but it illustrates the overlap, if you like, with the Art Nouveau movement.
So it's a bit like paintings as well, isn't it? There were different directions. People took it all sort of together in the Russian avant-garde, but there's probably different tendencies and different styles. This is a Swoboda Factory Club in Melnikov. So very nice. And we've
Yeah.
got very cool the Caoutchouc Factory Club Melnikov as well, 1927. This is a very nice, these stairs going up to a round building. I thought the building round is quite difficult rather than, building just a
Yeah. I mean, it's less straightforward than just putting up, straight, flat walls, as it were. But like I said, it gives you more options. It's less confining, if you like, than rectangular.
Absolutely.
No,
This
so-
is also very cool. This is Melnikov House in Moscow.
Mm.
One of top of UNESCO. It was at the top of UNESCO's list of endangered buildings.
Mm.
That looks
Mm.
very cool.
No.
Hotel in
He did some very good work, Melnikov, and hopefully it will not be demolished by the new builders in Moscow.
There's Yekaterinburg Hotel EZ, it's called now. I'm not sure what it was called then.
Mm. And as we're seeing, constructivist work can be found across the old Soviet Union. It wasn't just confined to the really big cities, and that's one way in which I think the constructivists survived and, to be frank, made their living by working in parts of the Soviet Union which were under less direct scrutiny by the authorities, shall we say.
This is the Narcofim building we've looked at. Looks like inside. I mean, doesn't look that beautiful, but if you look at the pictures from the inside, it actually is sort of one of those things. Perhaps when you're inside, it's very airy, very light, etc. MPS building, Moscow. I think we looked at this. Okay, yes, we've done them. Has anybody got any more comments or questions? Otherwise, we could perhaps bring this to an earlier end than usual, but thank you very much, comrade. We had originally planned for a second session tonight on Soviet symbolism and imagery, but that the comrade had to give his apologies, unfortunately. So thank you very much, Ken. Thank you, Ian, for your questions, and we'll send out the links to the books, and also I'll tidy up the video a bit because the beginning was a bit of a mess. Thank you, comrades. Next week, we're taking a week off next week because it's the funeral of Kevin Bean in Liverpool, who is one of the main person running the Weimar session. So we're taking 1 week off, and we'll be back November the 21st. Thank you. Good night, comrades.
Good night.